Can a smartphone with a 6000 mAh battery really be a selling point? That's what Oukitel is hoping with their K6000 Pro. Hey everyone, this is Alex from Android Headlines, and this is our full review of the Oukitel K6000 Pro. And it's Oukitel with an O, not an A. Now, as you can tell by the name, the headline feature on the smartphone is indeed the whopping 6000 mAh battery that's inside. That's almost twice the size of most smartphone batteries these days. And that's all with just a 5.5 inch 1080p display. The Oukitel K6000 Pro is a fairly cheap smartphone. It comes in at about $175 US. And at that price, with this large of a battery, you'd expect it to feel pretty cheap. But surprisingly, it does not. The body is made of aluminum, and the sides are slightly curved, which gives it a rather nice feel in the hand. Now, it's not as curved as the back on the Galaxy Note 5 or the Galaxy S7, but it's enough to make it feel more comfortable in the hand. Now, this is a fairly thick device, seeing as there's a 6000 mAh battery inside, so we're looking at about 9.7 millimeters on the thick side. So it's definitely thicker than most smartphones out there, but not overly thick where it's a pain to carry around. Now, the phone is a bit heavier than most phones, but you do get used to it pretty quickly. The front of the Oukitel K6000 Pro has 3 capacitive buttons. There's a menu button on the left side, a home button in the middle, and back on the right side. Unfortunately, there's no recents key, and we're forced to stick to long pressing the home button to jump into recents. Now, the front of the device is sort of plain, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It looks pretty good, although with the white model that we have here, you can see all the sensors on the front, and that's not something we're a huge fan of. We'd always rather have something that's black because then the sensors blend in and you don't really see them. Now, the display here is a 1080p display. Now, it's perhaps not our first choice for a 5.5 inch panel, but it is a bump over the K6000, which sported a 720p display. Now, obviously the K6000 had a slightly better battery life, seeing as it did have a slightly lower pixel display. Now, the IPS panel here is actually really good. All of the colors look vibrant, and most importantly, the digitizer works perfectly. We had no issues with the display recognizing touches on the panel at all. And that's something that we actually see quite often with smartphones in this range. The digitizer isn't always that great. Now, as far as button placement goes, we have the power button and volume rocker on the right side. The SIM card and SD card slot are on the left side. The micro USB port is on the bottom, with the 3.5mm headphone jack up at the top. So Oukitel did keep the 3.5mm headphone jack, and they might as well keep it since it is a 9.7mm thick smartphone. Now, the speaker is on the back, but what's interesting about the speaker is that when you cover up the speaker on the back, it doesn't change the sound at all. Normally it will sound a bit more muffled or quieter, but it sounds just as loud, just as great as it does when you're not covering it up. So it leads us to believe that there's a speaker somewhere else, probably in the earpiece, but it's tough to really tell. On to the most exciting part of this review, and that's the battery life, of course. Now, as you'd expect, battery life is amazing here on the Oukitel K6000 Pro. We were able to get over 9 hours on screen time and still had 26% left. Now, keep in mind that battery cycle was actually while the phone was roaming out of the country, and brightness was at about 50% and adaptive brightness was not on. So, you probably could get about 10 to 12 hours, maybe even a bit more if you really nurse the battery if you're a hardcore user. Now, it's definitely impressive, but the only downside with having such a large battery is that there's no quick charge feature here. The K6000 Pro does take a very long time to charge. Now, we clocked it at over 6 hours to charge to full, and that was from about 15 to 20%. Now, the Oukitel K6000 Pro does have a fingerprint sensor on the back. It's right below the camera, and since it is running Android 6.0 Marshmallow, it does support the fingerprint API, making the fingerprint sensor a whole lot more useful than it would if it were running Android 5.1 Lollipop. The fingerprint sensor was very accurate. It was actually really surprising given our recent experience with other smartphones and their fingerprint sensors. It recognized our fingerprint almost every single time, probably about 99 out of 100 times. It's not perfect, but it's probably about as close to perfect as you're going to get out of a fingerprint sensor these days. Now, with the software experience, we're looking at Android 6.0 Marshmallow, as we've already stated, and Oukitel is kept with a rather stock Android experience here, which is something that we're really a big fan of. Now, the biggest change here is actually the launcher. It's a bit more plain than the Google Now launcher is that you'd find on devices like the Nexus 6P or the Nexus 5X. So you do have an app drawer that's included, which is something that a lot of people over here in the West are really gonna like. App drawer scrolls horizontally and all your apps are listed in alphabetical order. It's pretty simple. And of course, if you don't like the launcher, you can always install a third-party launcher and have your way with that. Now the software is pretty fluid here on the K6000 Pro, and that's pretty much what we expected considering it's running the MediaTek MT6753 processor with 3 gigs of RAM, which is a pairing that we've seen a lot with a lot of recent smartphones that we've reviewed, like the Ulefone Vienna. Now when it comes to the camera, we have a 13 megapixel sensor around back. It's not the most amazing camera out there on the smartphone, but it could definitely be worse. Most of the shots we took came out fairly decent, although as you can tell from some of the images that are appearing in the video right now, the shutter can be a bit slow. Now this is especially noticeable on things that are moving like, you know, kids, animals and such. Surprisingly, if you turn on the zero shutter feature in settings, the shutter gets a bit slower, and it appears that it's doing that because it is bumping up the ISO and the shutter is being slower because of that. Now the camera app is pretty plain and simple, you know, everything is where you'd expect it to be basically. There's nothing all that special in settings, you know, as far as different modes that you can use to shoot with the camera. You know, you got your normal panorama, video, you know, auto mode, all that good stuff. The camera here isn't perfect, but it's good enough for taking pictures and posting on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and all those other social networks out there. Now as we've mentioned, the K6000 Pro is available for around $175 US, and you can pick it up from the link below in the description. Now this is a smartphone that's made for China, so naturally it does not work with the bands here in the US. A bit unfortunate, and just as a heads up, you'll be stuck with Edge here on T-Mobile and AT&T. Now that's the Oukitel K6000 Pro. It's a great smartphone, but if only it supported 4G LTE in the US, it would be a much better smartphone, especially for those here in the US. Now if you like this video, make sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.